What a fascinating interview with Noel B. Reynolds on the scribal school of the Manassites, or Josephites at least, and really giving you a completely different look at Scripture and how this was passed down. Lehi and Nephi appear to have been scribes, would have been a part of a scribal school from the time they were little boys, all the way down to Mormon and Moroni in the same type of school, and going all the way back perhaps to Abraham. This gives a completely different meaning to the very opening of the Book of Mormon in 1 Nephi 1, where Nephi talks about who he is and what he's doing with the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. This also contrasts the Manassite scribal school with the Judahite scribal school, which very well may have been rivals. And the Judahite scribal school is what produces the Old Testament. And the Manassite scribal school produces the brass plates, and then, of course, the Book of Mormon. Just fascinating information in this interview. Now, this episode is brought to you by Scripture Notes. I've talked a lot about Scripture Notes. I'm going to continue talking a lot about Scripture Notes. If you have not tried this out yet, go to scripturenotes.com and try out this software. It is an amazing tool. It's what I produce my book with. And as you delve into it, get used to it, it's really something else. Go to scripturenotes.com. Here we go. All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we have brought on Noel B. Reynolds. Noel, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Just a little bit of background on Noel. He received his MA and PhD from Harvard University. He's been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, Edinburgh University, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. One of the editors of the Encyclopedia of Mormonism from 1992. And several articles in the fields of legal and political philosophy and American founding. All right, Noel, really happy to have you on here. I've had many people recommend that I bring you on the show as one of the best scholars today. And running through your stuff here, it's been a while since I've looked at a couple of your papers, but really happy to be on, have you on the show. We're going to focus on scribalism, specifically Lehi and Nephi scribalism. Why is this important to understand Lehi and Nephi as scribes?
As modern readers of the Book of Mormon, the Bible, and so forth, we tend to be unaware of the oral cultures in which those books were written. We've, since Gutenberg, reading and writing have become quite universal. And we don't realize that in the ancient world, writing was important, but to get things written, you had to hire somebody to do it for you. And the scholars have estimated that less than 5% of the Egyptian elite were literate, and many of those estimates go down below 1%. Depends on the kind of writing you want to talk about. So when we see Lehi and Nephi are custodians of an ancient record, number one, which becomes the Holy Scriptures, the brass plates become the Holy Scriptures of the Nephites, and they contribute to that, and they write in both Hebrew and Egyptian. So they're literate in two languages. In the ancient world, there was no other way to become literate in multiple languages than to be taught from an early age in what would be called a scribal school, a family scribal school.
So this would tell us that Lehi's family is an elite family, right? These people would be like King's Court type of people.
That's exactly right. And of course, Lehi's family migrated to Jerusalem probably before the Assyrian conquest, which would have been in 730-ish, 720 to 730.
721, yeah.
Yeah, and they would have come to Jerusalem with other elites that fled the Assyrian conquest. And it's during that period of time that Jerusalem population exploded. Some people think it grew 15 times. So it was really an important time, but only the elites could afford that kind of a move and were in a position to undertake it. So now remind me of the original question and make sure I answered it.
Well, why is it important that we understand that they're scribes? I mean, we're talking about why they're probably elite individuals, right? So I mean, going beyond that, we know some more about the family as an example. Okay, if they had to be elites to be in a scribal school, they know metallurgy, for example.
Yeah.
Right. Nephi knows metallurgy along with this. They're obviously very well educated. This is not just some family that's, run out of town.
That's exactly right. It's, well, they had a lot more to lose in the invasion. They were wealthy. And the Assyrians, first thing they would do is strip people of their wealth and send that off to their capital. But it's important because we have them reading and writing. And the only way to understand that is if they had this kind of education. And then if they were passing that education on down to their children, what I've recently documented, this isn't fully published yet, but there are no gaps in Nephite history that Mormon doesn't tell us how the plates and the responsibility of chief scribe is passed on from one generation to another. He documents that all through the Book of Mormon. The scribes could be wealthy in multiple ways. One is by providing scribal services that were needed. But the other is not all the members of the family would necessarily be inclined towards scribalism. In fact, it usually probably was a minority of the family. And so these scribal families in the ancient world tended to have businesses on the side. Nibley, for example, speculated that Lehi may have been a merchant that was trading with distant cities. That would be very compatible with a scribal family's activities. They've also speculated, that he was a metallurgist because for multiple reasons. But metallurgy also was commonly associated with scribal families. In the scholars who have documented scribalism in ancient Ugarit specifically point to the connection with metallurgy. They could be blacksmiths and scribes. The scribal schools would have a shop, a workshop, in which they would produce their own materials. There was no store you could go to downtown and buy plates, that you could buy writing materials. Who's the market for writing materials? It's just the scribes. Mm-hmm. So they had to make their own. And they had these workshops where they did all of that. And metal was commonly associated with scribes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Another connection I've seen written up before is metallurgy with priesthood.
Yes.
It could be that priesthood and metallurgy oftentimes go together. There are several phrases, especially in the Old Testament, that bring up this type of, iron and metal that has to do with the scriptures and has to do with the priests as well. So there's also a connection there.
Well, the point you bring up right there is one we could elaborate on just a little bit. And that is now very good evidence that the ancient world did have writing on metal. They had iron pens, for example, was part of a standard scribal kit. And they could use it to write on stone or on metal. But what the metal writing, the writings on metal have not survived unless they were buried away somewhere They were commonly buried in the cornerstones of temples, for example. But those are, they're not accessible. But later generations would find something written on metal. They would not value that writing.
Sure.
They would value the metal.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would be recycled.
And that you even get this in the warnings to Joseph Smith when he gets the plates.
That's right.
It's like, look, they got the value here. This is great value. This is probably something that maybe has been repeated over and over again to these scribes and those that held the plates, not just to Joseph Smith.
And that makes the point exactly, that it's always been true.
Yeah. Now you talk about the scribal school here that goes on. So you've got something that Lehi and Nephi would have, but then these keepers of the plates that are writing in here may not all necessarily be prophets, for example. So, I mean, you've got all of the writers in the small plates. I don't know if, you've got Amni, Amaron, Chemish, Abinadom, and Amaleki. Are these scribes? Are they prophets? Are they both? Obviously, after this, where King Benjamin pulls back gets it's Benjamin or Mosiah gets the plates back under the king. From then on, we seem to see the prophet as the one who has got the plates.
That's because we only, in the Book of Mormon, we only are getting the perspective presented by Mormon, who was a prophet. In the Book of Helaman, chapter 3, Mormon gives us a much broader view into this business of keeping records on plates among the Nephites. And he points out there that there are records of every kind. It's commercial records, military records, political records, and religious records. All these, the prophecies and everything like that was included in those records. But it was a vast collection of records that were handed down through the official Nephite scribal school, all the way down to Amaron, who selected one of his very young students, Mormon, to be his successor. And so Mormon is
student of a scribal school. Then Mormon would have been in a scribal school.
Well, Amaron goes to him when he's age 10 and says, I observe that you're, I'm forgetting the wording now, a serious,
sober or something like that.
Sober, yeah, that was the word he used. Thanks. And when you are 24, so in 14 years, go to the hill where I have stashed all of the Nephite records, because the scribal school at that point was in disarray. It had dissolved, and Amaron saw the future, wanted Mormon to finish off the large plates of Nephi, which had been kept by that official scribal school all the way down to Mormon's time. Mm-hmm. He wanted him to finish that off and tell about the final demise of the Nephites, which Mormon then did, not on the schedule that Amaron gave him, because that schedule was interrupted by the Lamanite Wars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so let me back up again, back to Nephi. Yeah, so let's go right to the beginning here of First Nephi 1.
Yes.
And we oftentimes think about Nephi and how he introduces himself. He's of goodly parents. These are common Hebraic introductions to books, the way he does it. Paul does something similar sometimes. What do we get out of these here, especially the first 3 verses, as I'm looking at it? Maybe it's beyond this, but the first 3 verses are very interesting with what you're saying, keeping what you're saying in mind about being a scribe.
That's see, Nephi, once you understand the role, how scribal schools worked, how scribalism worked in the ancient world, it's clear that Nephi is a scribe, and he's introducing himself as a scribe in those first 3 verses. I was taught somewhat in all the learning of my father. His father is a learned man. He is a learned man coming out of 7th century Jerusalem. And there's only one way you can become a learned man in that world, was to be educated in a scribal school. What we're going to find out is that it's not one of the Judahite scribal schools that produced the Old Testament. Yeah. He then goes on and says, having been highly favored of the Lord, yea, having had a great knowledge of the goodness and mysteries of God, therefore I make a record. Nobody can make a record if he isn't a trained scribe. Most scribes, now this is another thing, is the scribes themselves may have been a very tiny percentage of the total population, but most of those scribes would be involved in writing things for other people, like letters, military communications, most likely commercial communications, business communications. Legal. Yeah, these vast libraries that we found, that have been found in Mesopotamia, for example, on clay tablets with the cuneiform script. These are our biggest libraries, and they're primarily commercial records. And so so it's really, out of all the scribes there are who are working at all these different levels, and a boy trained for just 4 years or more could serve some of these scribal functions and make a living at it, writing for people who had money and who needed that writing. But he goes on to say, I make a record in the language of my father. So all of a sudden now, we're not talking, he's not writing in the vernacular, the Hebrew vernacular. What is the language of his father? It consists of the learning of the Jews, and he's probably here using Jews he often uses the word Jews when he's referring to Israelites in general. But the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. Now, my observation, my experience is that as Latter-day Saints reading the Book of Mormon, we tend to skip over that. We think he's writing in Hebrew. He tells us straight out, he's writing in the language of the Egyptians. Now, what's the reason for that? The brass plates are written in Egyptian, and that is his holy scriptures. And he's writing revelations that he and his father have received and teaching their meaning. He sees this as future scripture, and he sees Egyptian as the appropriate language for scripture.
Yeah. Now I want to get into that a little bit, because I tie a lot of, I do tours out in Egypt, and I love tying all these things back to Egypt. People don't realize the connections of the Israelites to the Egyptians, because there's just that one story of the Exodus, and everybody thinks, well, Egypt evil, Israelites good, and there's this massive separation between the two, when in reality they were completely intertwined. You can't get away from the culture of Egypt. You can't get away from the culture of Egypt. So the language of his father is Egyptian, and being that he is Manassite and therefore descendant from Joseph, that makes all the sense in the world to me.
Well, that's seeing for Nephi and for the writers from the Northern Kingdom, they go back, their families go back to Joseph of Egypt. And Joseph married an Egyptian princess.
Yeah, Asenath.
He has two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. What language was taught in their home? Right. What did the servants speak? Who did they marry? They're there for quite a while before Jacob and the other brothers of Joseph are brought back to Egypt, speaking probably Canaanite, which is a parent language for Hebrew. And
wouldn't Joseph have spoken Egyptian then?
Absolutely.
I mean, to command and do what he did, he had to have been speaking Egyptian. Here's the question, though, is when did he actually learn that?
Yeah. Now here's my theory, and it's speculation. I haven't any other way of proving it than the reasons I might offer right now. But it seems to me, see, Egyptian was the only language available for Abraham and Moses to write in. Okay. They wrote in Egyptian, and their records were being passed down. Abraham tells us in the first chapter of the book of Abraham that he's writing this for his posterity. Well, which one of them lost it, threw it away? Isaac, Jacob, Joseph? See, I don't think any of them threw it away. Okay, I think they were passing it down and teaching the language so that they could use it.
Yeah, and I'm going to get to this because I have a really big question on this, because you're talking about a rivalry school then, eventually, that may pop up here, and why it would pop up. But I wanted to comment, first of all, on your theory of Joseph. So looking already at the samples that we have, we know that Nephi was a young man, right? He's a young man at this time, and yet he has all of this knowledge. He has all of this skill. And so you have to imagine that he is at a very, very young age when he enters into this type of a school where he would gain all of this, right? Now, going further now to the very end, we get to Mormon, who apparently is in a school already at 10 years old, and enough to the point that he's already been recognized by Ammoron as someone who can do what he needs him to do already at that age. So you've got two very young men here at the beginning, at the end of the Book of Mormon, that seem to be in a school situation where they are learning all of these things. Now, add Joseph into this. Is Joseph a very young man in Canaan, learning these things at a very young age also, that allows him, when he's taken into Egypt, possibly a huge advantage for him to be able to flourish?
Exactly. Well, there's kind of two points to make here. One is that the beginning scribal students often were just 4 or 5 years old.
Okay.
That's been pretty well established for Mesopotamian and Egyptian scribal schools. So they got into it early. And by the time they were 9 or 10 years old, they had learned enough to be taking on certain kinds of scribal labor, and, to get jobs.
Sure.
Writing things for people and reading things for people. Now, going back to Joseph, I think the evidence would be that of all of Jacob's children, Joseph is the obvious one to have received the scribal training. He was the favorite son. He's not, in the biblical representation, he's not out helping with the sheep herding. He's at home in a nice coat. Which would be much more compatible with the scribal activity. Mm-hmm. And then when he gets to Egypt, he shoots to the top.
Yeah.
His first employer puts him in charge of the whole house. Well, he can't do that if he can't speak Egyptian.
Or have skills.
Yes,
honestly,
that's right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, this adds to some other things in with Latter-day Saints, and that is, okay, well then, if there is a tradition of scribalism starting with Abraham and maybe before, we've got Abraham's writing. Where is Isaac's? Where is Jacob's? And of course, where is Joseph's? Now we know a little bit about that, but where are those writings? If they were scribes, did they write it all? I mean, Joseph did. We know that.
And Joseph's writings are inserted into the Book of Mormon in different places. They're
Yeah.
quoted out of the brass plates by different Book of Mormon writers. So that's so we know he made records. Jeff Lindsay and I have written a series of articles in which we've argued that the Book of Moses version of Genesis that is given to Joseph Smith without much explanation. He doesn't really tell us much about how that was revealed to him, but it contains all kinds of things that are not in the Bible. A lot of text, all the Enoch stuff, for example. We've identified at this point, I think Jeff's up to 33 examples of phrases, words, concepts developed in the Book of Moses that are not paralleled in the Bible. And they are in the Book of Mormon.
Interesting.
Well, the conclusion we drew from that is that the Book of Mormon, the brass plates, contained the same version or much the same version of the Book of Moses' writings as did the brass plates.
Yeah,
So,
that's pretty interesting. There's another author. There's a book that just came out from a friend of mine that he talks about the Apocrypha in the Book of Mormon, and he does something similar. He says that the Genesis Apocryphon is actually seems to be more along the lines of what the brass plates contained.
Yeah. So it's and the other thing is I've advanced a much weaker argument to claim that even the Book of Abraham is reflected in certain ways in the Book of Mormon.
That's interesting.
But that's a very weak argument. I don't have anything like the evidence that we have for saying that about the Book of Moses.
Implying that the Book of Abraham may have been in the brass plates also.
Right.
Okay.
And it and the writings of Moses would have been written in Egyptian.
Okay. Yes. That is something I have thought about also. Wouldn't that make more sense that these things were written in Egyptian and then kept in Egyptian, which would have been an Israelite, not just perhaps then, I mean, Moses is a Levite, but at least an Israelite tradition that is founded on the fact that they all lived in Egypt for so long.
That's right.
Yeah.
But and one other very important point, Greg, Egyptian writing was the only script available in Abraham's time, in Joseph's time, and in Moses' time. There was no, scholars do not believe that Hebrew developed until after really the time of King David, the Hebrew script that is used in the Bible.
Okay, not even like a Proto-Hebrew type, not something that would be used for writing anyway.
That is when Proto-Hebrew evolved.
Okay.
The actual alphabet, it might be worth just a little detour here on this topic. The actual Semitic, not Semitic, I want to say, well, West Semitic alphabet, which is the one that Hebrew is derived from, has been evidenced at least 1900 BC. But there are no continuous texts coming in that that have been discovered in that script before 800 or 700 BC.
Okay.
And even those are very short. But if the Bible, and that's why Bible scholars believe that the Judahite scribal schools in Jerusalem during the 7th century transcribed the oral traditions of Israel into the books of scripture that we now have. So these Bible scholars have finally, and it's because of this unavailability of a script to write them in, that they were transcribed from oral traditions in the 7th century. That would be during Lehi's lifetime. And then there's clear evidence that those traditions, as transcribed, were there were a variety of them, competing traditions that were harmonized in that century under the kings at the end of the century, and Josiah particularly. And
when you say harmonized, will you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, if there's competing traditions coming out of these oral traditions, mm-hmm. competing written traditions, then somebody sits down and says, okay, let's make one version of this. And in so doing, they often preserve some of the competing versions and you see that in the Bible. You'll see things repeated, but somewhat differently in the Old Testament. So that's why Bible scholars, as a group, tend to be somewhat skeptical of the validity of the origin stories of the Israelite people, because they don't. It's hard to believe that a firm scriptural text could be preserved orally across a 1,000-year period.
However, though, what about if Moses can write in Egyptian,
right?
And we're talking Moses here. What are we looking at? About 1500 BC?
12 to 13.
12 to 1300 BC. Why wouldn't the tradition continue on from Moses? Wouldn't he not set up a scribal school that was focused on Egyptian? And bring that with him and have them rewrite everything and keep everything in Egyptian?
The Jerusalem scribal schools exhibit no familiarity with Egyptian.
That's interesting to me. So
but look what you've got. I mean, and this is the brass plates to the rescue. The brass plates claim to be written in Egyptian, going back possibly even to Abraham.
Right, and I believe that. I think that is right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So now we're going to go back to the competing sides here of what we end up with. We end up with a Josephite tradition and legacy handed down to the Ephraimites or Manassites that would be eventually severed from Judah into a different kingdom, and perhaps keeping a different set of records than what the Judahites are keeping.
It's probably worth interjecting here what's going on in Palestinian archaeology. Over the last 30 years, the archaeologists have moved away from the version of Israelite history that comes out of the Old Testament, based on the following observation: that Jerusalem was always a very, very small place, mainly agricultural, until the invasion or the migration of all those elites that moved out of the northern kingdom in the Assyrian conquest. Your Manassite school would have been in the northern kingdom all that time. They obviously were preserving an Egyptian language tradition. And so when they come to Jerusalem, they have a tradition that they see going back in written form all the way to Abraham.
Yeah.
And and that would include the Moses stuff. Mm-hmm. Would have been originally written in Egyptian. Meanwhile, the Judahites start collecting oral traditions in the 7th century and writing those down, and that becomes our basic books of the Old Testament. One possibility that occurs to me, people have wondered how did those traditions, oral traditions over 1,000 years, how did they last? And the answer I would suggest is that in fact that isn't what happened. That that the Judahite oral traditions in Hebrew were their own versions of what they were hearing from the Manassites out of the northern kingdom. So it wasn't 1,000-year lapse. It was maybe even just one generation of oral tradition that was being transcribed. And that's why the Old Testament is as accurate as it is.
Yeah.
But it would all saying that it goes back primarily to what was in the brass plates. The Bible, so I say brass plates to the rescue. The brass plates in that interpretation would be the original source of the Old Testament. But having gone through a generation or two of oral tradition in Hebrew.
Yeah. And it seems to me, Noel, that, you look at other examples of where these types of, where you have schisms, right, within the people. And you go to the Jews and the Christians. And what starts to happen? Well, the Jews have got the Septuagint. They praise it as this incredible document. It's amazing. They've compiled all these books together and put it into Greek. And then as the Christians grow in popularity, they take the Septuagint and they say, no, this thing is almost to the point of saying almost like it's evil. And they put it away and they move on. And somewhere in between that and the 9th century AD, we end up with a Masoretic text.
Right.
And so there's that schism seems to force some differences. Not major necessarily, but there seems to be some differences that are forced there. Would we see the same thing between the Josephites, of the north, and what the Judahites are going to compile? Are they going to have a concern about what the Josephites have, and do we need to make some changes here?
That's an excellent question, and here's what I've come to so far on pursuing that question. First, that it was the Josephites who were dwindling after immigrating to Jerusalem. They were dwindling in their cohesion among themselves. They were getting adapted into the Jewish society, and they may very well have had a fear that the Jewish versions of their traditions that were being advanced would replace the true Manassite version. Mm-hmm. And that would be the primary motivation for creating the brass plates. Hmm. So the brass plates, on that view, I don't see them as something that Abraham started or that Joseph started. Rather, I see the Manassite scribal school would have done what other scribal schools did and maintained a library. Yes. And that library was probably essentially papyrus scrolls that they were passed down from generation to generation. And as one scroll would wear out, the scribes would would update it. They just make it a clean new copy. But when you get down to Lehi's time, if these motivations, these concerns about the Judahite versions that were developing became and the foreseeable demise of the Manassite tradition. I mean, here's Babylon's army marching west 100 miles a year. That they may have been highly motivated to create a permanent tradition that would speak to the ages, that would bear witness to the ages. And the Bible uses that kind of language a couple of times for writing on metal to make witness. And that's in Jeremiah And
So you're talking about the Babylonians. The Babylonians coming to Jerusalem. So you're talking about this, something like this happening maybe in the latter half of the 7th century.
well, it's the Babylonians come in. What is it? 687, 587, when they carry the Jerusalem elite.
Well, yeah, when they, of course, Lehi leaves before that, but
yeah, not much.
Not much. Yeah, maybe 10 years. But so, of course, the brass plates also, if we look at another parallel, we look at the Book of Mormon, you've got 1,000 years of history there, and Mormon is assigned to pull it all together into one book and put it on plates. If you even went to Abraham down to Lehi, you've got about 1,100 years. Something similar, right? It could be something similar in that case, where you're drawing all of the records together and putting them into something permanent.
That's right.
And maybe Lehi is involved. I don't know. He seems to not know some things about his genealogy from the brass plates. I don't know if that's being read wrong, but
yes, I think it is read wrong in that let's see, what's the word that he used? It's not discover. The word that Lehi uses to say he found his genealogy there. When we read that cold, we may get the impression that he didn't know his genealogy before. But if we look at what the Hebrew word would have been, it could easily be just he read it or confirmed it.
Yeah, he found it is what it says.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean discover. And so that's one where the English can mislead us.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm telling you an interesting story. So in this day and age, Google Books is madly digitizing old books,
mm-hmm.
and thousands of them. So I got on Google and just searched for brass plates. I don't know if you saw this before, but let me tell you what I found. The thing that came up was a 17th century experience of an English sea captain. His name, Alexander Hamilton. And Alexander Hamilton spent 30 years of his life in the late 1600s, taking his ship up and down the west coast of India, just moving goods from one port to another. And then he retired to London and wrote his memoir. And in that memoir, which is available on Google Books, he says that the ancient Jewish colony in Kerala told him that they were descendants of Manassites that were captured by the Babylonians, taken to the eastern end of the Babylonian Empire, and then abandoned when the Persians took over for the Babylonians 10, 20 years later. They didn't want all those Jewish captives and let them go. Now, some of the Judahites went back to Jerusalem. These Manassites went south to India and found a king, a local king in southern India, who took them in. He saw ways he could use them in the military, and they were more learned than his people, and he used them in various ways. But he took them in, and they said they had brought with them their records on brass plates.
Very interesting.
It's very interesting.
So a Manassite tribe outside of the Americas heads out, goes to India, and their oral tradition is that when they came, they brought brass plates.
Exactly.
That is really interesting.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
You go to Kerala today, and
That's part of India, right?
Whatever Jewish population is there is integrated, or a lot of those people came back to Israel when Israel was founded.
Mm.
And so what you have is a bunch of abandoned synagogues, but you don't have any brass plates, and nobody knows what happened to those.
Yeah, maybe they're in the cornerstone of one of those buildings. Who knows?
There you go. Get a metal detector and go over there and look for them. The thought that goes through my mind is, if and when the Lord wants that second brass plates witness to surface, it will.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, that's fascinating. That's really interesting. Okay, so I want to back up here again a little bit, and in the I want to talk about the Egyptian that's used here. Now, Nibley talks about talking about Reformed Egyptian, and he talks about, well, maybe this is Meroitic, right? There were some people that came into Egypt, like several peoples did, and took over, and there was a variation of the Egyptian that was used, but that is only mentioned in Moroni 9 or Mormon 9 by Moroni. Right at the very end, 1,000 years later, it seems to me that, and I still think it's hieratic that they would be using, because that's the Holy Script. That's what they would have been using before. And you've got 1,000 years from the time that Lehi leaves until you've got you've got Moroni. And that's a long time for a language to hold on to itself. I mean, you look at Old English 1,000 years ago, that, right now, you go to 1024, that's before Middle English even really starts to come in from the Normans. And so you go back and look at it, and I've done this a lot. I cannot understand it. I've read it, I've studied it, I've gone through it, I still can't get it. You would have to be an expert to understand English from 1024.
Oh, that's right.
And so maybe we're speaking and writing Reformed English right now.
Let me try something on you.
Okay.
The West Semitic or Canaanite or Phoenician, you can use all those terms. The alphabet that was invented in the 19th century BC, or 20th century BC, you use the following strategy. For each consonant in West Semitic languages, they borrowed a hieratic sign for an Egyptian word that started with that consonant.
Okay.
Now, once you understand that, would it make sense to call the original? Now, this is the first alphabet in the world, as far as we know.
But you're saying the first alphabet is Egyptian?
No. The first alphabet, it's not. It's using Egyptian signs for the consonants in the West Semitic languages.
Okay, so I mean, it's we use Phoenician signs.
No, the signs are borrowed from hieratic.
Okay,
that's the interesting connection. So it's somebody in Egypt, in the Nile area, the Nile Delta area, who himself is a West Semite, is trying to get a way to write his language, West Semitic. And he borrows the signs from the Egyptian script that begin from four words that begin with a consonant he's trying to represent in West Semitic.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, it's genius.
It's genius. I still wonder, though, I mean, wouldn't Joseph have been speaking and writing in hieratic?
Yes.
And wouldn't he have passed that on to Ephraim and Manasseh?
No. It's yes. I think the brass plates are written in hieratic.
Okay.
But what you've got now is some West Semites learning how to write their language using signs borrowed from Egyptian, not signs that mean the same thing, signs from words that have the same consonant.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting.
No meaning. There's no meaning connection.
That's interesting.
It's just the sounds. So that's what an alphabet is, the sounds, right? The different letters represent sounds. You have, 23, 24 consonants? And so you need to borrow those from 23 or 24 Egyptian words.
Yeah.
The only connection is the same sound.
Right.
So what would you call that script?
Very possibly Reformed Egyptian.
Yes. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great theory.
Now you got to add one more. You got to extend that 1,000 years of Nephite history, in which the Nephite language changes a lot. Now we're talking about the Nephite vernacular, which would have started out as Hebrew. But notice when they come to Zarahemla and meet the Mulekites, they can't understand each other. They both started with Hebrew, and in 450, 500 years, their languages are not mutually intelligible. And so Nephi and Moroni tells us at the end, he says, no one knows our language. So now we're dealing with 3 languages and 3 scripts in Mormon and Nephi's time. Egyptian, the brass plates, they've got to be able to read that to be able to teach out of the brass plates. The Hebrew, because some of the brass plates is probably in Hebrew. Almost certainly Isaiah and Jeremiah were written in Hebrew. And thirdly, Nephite. And the large plates have been kept in Nephite, and he tells us that we've adjusted that writing to fit the changes in our language. The Book of Mormon tells us that. So they may have started off writing in Hebrew. The large plates probably were written in Hebrew in the first few generations. But as the Nephite language evolved, how do you think they changed the writing to fit the evolving language?
Right.
If they did the same thing that the inventor of the West Semitic alphabet did, if they searched they knew Egyptian, they could go to Egyptian, find the new consonants they needed, and use those to reform the Nephite script.
Yeah, as their language changed.
And continue to call it Reformed Egyptian.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Hey, I'm going to have you look into the camera, though. I've got you to the side there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're good.
I'm looking at the wrong screen.
But when you moved, I saw something behind you. Now I can see it barely over. Is that the judgment scene from the Book of Joseph?
Yes.
Okay. So.
No, it's from. It's just from an Egyptian pyramid.
Script,
a scroll.
It looks a little like what the Book of Joseph judgment scene. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now I want to go back to Abraham here for a second, because this is something I've always, you've got kind of 2 schools on Abraham's origins, his geographic origins.
Yes.
One is Ur, that's it would be in today's Iraq.
Right.
And one is Ur, which is, and I don't remember the full names of these, but the one is Ur that would be in southeast Turkey and up the Syrian area, northern Syrian area.
Yeah.
Right. I've always thought, and I saw that in your writings that you say the same thing, that this is probably, geographically, it seems like it has to be up in the north because of where Haran is.
That's exactly. I think the best source on that, John Gee has pointed this out, and that's the reference to Olishim in the Book of Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
There is an Olishim in northern Syria, northwest Syria, and which fits very well with the Book of Abraham. It's also the case that Sanli Urfa, ancient Aleppo, is today called Sanli Urfa, and it is still claimed in that city that Abraham was born there. And that's all in northwest Syria, right up there at the very tip of that little piece of the Mediterranean Sea that reaches up. It's right there.
Yep.
And that's that version of the geography, as John Gee and subsequently Steve Smoot have argued, makes far more sense than a southern Ur for Book of Abraham and other reasons. Yeah,
and that's, I think, also just looking at the why are they going all the way up to Haran from down in Iraq?
Right.
When that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But anyway,
exactly.
I want to push back a little bit on the Manassite scribes.
Okay.
And tell me what, I don't know if you've heard these things but there are several references in church history. You've got Franklin D. Richards, you've got Erastus Snow, you've got Parley P. Pratt. Those three are few of them that all reference Ishmael, right? That they go back for Ishmael's family to get his daughters. Ishmael as an Ephraimite, and that his sons, his kids are all Ephraimites. Now, there's also a fourth corroboration on that from a convert from 1835 that knew Joseph Smith personally and said that he heard Joseph in 1835 say these same things about Ishmael.
Yes,
but also that Zoram was an Ephraimite.
Yeah.
And that therefore it is implied that Laban was an Ephraimite. And that even the sword of, there's also some newspaper articles and other testimony from early saints of those that knew Martin Harris, who was the scribe for the lost 116 pages, that even the sword was supposed to be Joseph's sword that carried down all the way to Joshua, who conquered Canaan with the sword, and then it comes down to Laban. Now, I don't know if a sword can last that long, but that's what they said, right. That it was originally Joseph's sword. So he would have, if that were the case, right, he would have the sword of Joseph and the plates or the records of Joseph because Joshua was an Ephraimite, right, through an Ephraimite line. Would it be not just a Manassite school, but maybe a Josephite school?
There's no way to know about that for sure, that I'm aware of. But keep in mind the geography of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
North of Jerusalem, Ephraimite territory came down really close to Jerusalem. There's a Benjamite area there, but when you go look at your map there, you see Ephraim is only a day's walk from Jerusalem. And that Manasseh was given, the tribe of Manasseh was assigned by Moses to the premier area north of the Ephraimites. And the Manassites were given the largest area. They were given the ancient sacred sites where Abraham built altars and so forth. And Samaria, which eventually is the capital of the northern kingdom, how many miles is that from Jerusalem? 50?
I would guess maybe somewhere around there.
Yeah, these are all small distances.
Yeah.
So, and very possibly Ephraimites and Manassites would have come to Jerusalem. It's also the case that the capital of the Manassites shifted to the sacred sites, I should say, and even a temple, a Manassite temple was many people think they found a Manassite temple or an Israelite temple in Shiloh that predates Jerusalem.
Okay.
So, and certainly they had that farther north. There was a temple there when the Manassites were assigned to Shechem. And Shechem was the central holy site.
Yes.
And
where Jacob was, yeah.
Yeah, so that's all. If the Manassites were established there in Shechem, they, within 1 or 2 centuries, had moved south to Shiloh area. And there's a couple of different places down there where it may have been their scribal and religious center. Yeah. And so now the Ephraimites were conspicuous in the government of the Northern Kingdom more than, but and there's no tracking of this because we have the Judahite version of the Old Testament that was composed in Jerusalem in the 7th century, which glorifies the Judahite tradition through David and Solomon, and
which is why they might not talk much about a temple in Shiloh,
and appreciates the tradition of the Northern Kingdom. And what I was started to say earlier, and I got myself off the argument, but what the archaeologists think is that the Northern Kingdom was far wealthier, far more important politically, and even dominant over the Southern Kingdom for centuries. And that's what the archaeology argues when they start digging these places up and looking at them, that the Northern Kingdom actually was the kind of empire with long distance influence that the Old Testament describes for Solomon. So it looks, and the other thing that happens in the Old Testament that we have, the Judahite Old Testament, is that there was the just straight out attempt to centralize all legitimate worship in the Jerusalem temple. And so the Northern Kingdom's temples were disqualified by King Josiah's reforms, and those holy sites were devalued. So we don't have the answer to that, but that's what over the last 30 years, Palestinian archaeologists are pretty much shifting to that point of view. Yeah. Whereas they had always used the Old Testament as a guide for interpreting archaeology, they're now saying, no, the Old Testament is a rewriting of history.
So that, it was a rewriting of Israel. The Old Testament's a rewriting of Israel. Now, a lot of people will say also, biblical scholars will also say that it wasn't actually until a post-exilic period that they wrote the Old Testament. Because you have things like Deutero or Trito, Isaiah, that is post-exilic or claimed to be post-exilic, and it was compiled afterward.
I think, and some of the more radical critiques argue that basically all of the Old Testament is post-exilic.
Yeah.
Well, the oldest actual writing that we have from Israel is like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's, things that are 300 BC.
Yeah.
Well, that's 3 centuries after the exile.
Yeah. So the oldest is 300 BC that we were of writings that we actually have, and that's not far from the Septuagint. So obviously there's something in place before that, but as they're translating these things into Greek. But okay, so what's interesting to me, because I follow the Josiah reforms and all that. I've read Barker and all those things, and other archaeologists. Obviously, I think most archaeologists and biblical scholars will say that there was a Deuteronomic reform, and but many people say that the Deuteronomists come from the north, and that they probably influenced even King Hezekiah and at the time of Isaiah, and they were already down south at that point, and maybe it's because they came from the Assyrian attack previously. But you would then have, if that's the case, a religion that is very anti-Christ, in a sense, coming from the same source that we get the brass plates from. Not the same source, I mean geographically the same source, right? If they come from the north. So you'd have the Deuteronomists coming down into Jerusalem, but then you've also got the tradition of the Josephites with the brass plates, both infiltrating the Jews at Jerusalem.
The idea of the Deuteronomists came from the north. Now I'm not an Old Testament specialist, and so I just go along. I just use what other people say that are well informed in those areas. But my recollection is that's based on just a few minor things, some of which are linguistic. But it is the Deuteronomists that are pushing the glory and veracity of the Southern religious and political traditions at the expense of the Northern reputation. So that's you're correct to point out that those seem to be contradictory points, and I'm certainly not qualified to judge over to settle it. But my impression is that it doesn't have to be a contradiction.
What do we know, going back even further, about an Abrahamic scribal tradition? I mean, you mentioned that likely he's writing in Egyptian. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, he's writing in Egyptian. Maybe whatever. If he's getting this from his father, who was a priest, right, and whatnot, where are they borrowing this from? Does this go further back in his?
Yes,
it must go further back.
I'm actually working on that problem right now, trying to reconstruct the writing tradition back through Abraham. Abraham says he gets the record from the fathers, and that he's going to pass it down with his additions to
just those phrases start to mean something different based on what you're saying. He gets the records from the fathers.
Yes.
This is not just a pass it down. This is a scribal tradition.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's evidently a problem with his immediate father. But how he winds up with the records of the fathers is he doesn't articulate that. He doesn't give us a blow-by-blow account. He just says he wound up with it. So it's the other thing that needs to be factored in here is that when you place Abraham's Ur in northwest Syria, or southeast Turkey, that area, that is an area that during Abraham's lifetime would have been an Egyptian province. And the evidence of that is also in the Book of Abraham, where we've got the Egyptian priest is running the show religiously and sacrificing people. But also there would have been an Egyptian overseer for that area governmentally, and it would seem very likely that Abraham and his father were associated with that administrative unit. And that's why Abraham is learning Egyptian himself as a child.
Yeah.
That his father is integrated into the Egyptian provincial government at a high level.
And why they would know him as someone that would eventually be sacrificed. I mean, the other ones that are being sacrificed are royalty also from Ham, the daughters.
That's right. They're prominent people. Now, there's a whole range of other evidence that is hard to evaluate. There's all kinds of legends about Abraham, about his youth, the education he was getting, how brilliant he was, that they were involved with the Egyptian government. But none of these can be validated by any continuous written tradition. So how they, where they come from, a lot of them are clearly spurious.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just almost impossible to sort that out. Certainly, I'm not qualified to do that. I think it should be recognized. We're talking so much about Abraham, and this. We should mention, John Gee's most recent introduction to the Book of Abraham mm-hmm. is probably our best source. And Stephen Smoot has. He's still in graduate school. I think he's at Catholic University now. But in the time he's had, he's worked a lot on these Egyptian things and is trying to improve our understanding of Abraham as well. So we do have some LDS scholars who are actually to be taken very seriously on all these topics. They haven't focused on the kind of thing you and I've been talking about, mm-hmm. but if people are interested in that kind of thing, they really should read Gee's book and some of the articles that Smoot has published, which are all available free at Scripture Central.
Yeah, Stephen's been on the program before.
Okay, good.
Yeah, he's great. Does this, finishing up here, is this? When you read about the scribes in Jesus's time, does this change your idea and context of who these individuals are and what they represent at that time? Because they're definitely one of the groups that are called out by Jesus.
Yeah, it's, well, I don't think we can assign scribes and non-scribes with good guys and bad guys. That would never hold up. What you have, the scribes are earning a living using their literacy and their training in literacy and their knowledge of the law, the scriptures, and so forth, for good or bad purposes. And a lot of that has to do with who's paying the piper. And that's certainly what we see in Jesus's time, that the Pharisees and others are paying the piper, and the scribes and also the monarchy. All of these have scribes. Mm-hmm. So who the scribes were that Jesus was interacting with, they weren't paid by him, and they weren't. They were very much in the traditions, say, of the different Jewish sects, but they also serve much broader function in society, and they are in many cases they function as lawyers.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's like lawyers today. They a lot of them never go to court. Even they're writing documents.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's. But they are the intellectuals of their society.
Yeah.
They are the ones that have a broad background. They have time on their hands to think about things, and they are good with words, mm-hmm. And they can influence the government, they can influence the religious leaders, they can influence the populace. They are educated to speak and write.
Yeah. Well, this is all fascinating stuff. It opens up the doors to so many new things to consider throughout the scriptures and throughout history. Is there anything else we're missing that you really wanted to get across?
Well, you've hit the main points. You may have noticed I've got 5 or 6 different papers, and especially it pushed this down into Nephite times. Mm-hmm. We've touched on a little of that, but I've also got a paper on the brass plates, and I think one of the big takeaways for me is that we can see that Lehi prophesied that the brass plates would come to all people at some point in time. They would retain their brightness, mm-hmm. is his phrase. And when they do, my vision of that is that the brass plates will rescue the Bible from all the skepticism about Abraham, about the prophets, about Adam and Eve. These things we'll get a record that will completely change how the educated world will see that history. Just I'll make this as a final point. Go back to chapter 29 of 2nd Nephi. And in that chapter, the Lord tells Nephi repeatedly, I will speak to the Jews, I will speak to the Nephites, I will speak to the lost tribes of Israel, and I will speak to all peoples throughout the earth, and they shall write it. Mm-hmm. And that all these things will come together in the end times as testimonies of Jesus Christ. And that gets reiterated multiple times in that chapter 29. And so, but those things were said to people in oral societies who depended on scribes to write. Mm-hmm. And I think that that kind of reinforces the connection between scribes and prophets that we see in the Book of Mormon and probably in the Bible. But in the Bible, we don't get anything like what we have in the Book of Mormon. In the Book of Mormon, we actually know who's writing what. Mm-hmm. And the Bible hardly ever does that. Jeremiah says he's using a scribe. Isaiah probably was writing for himself. And after that, we don't know. So it's, but the brass plates, having a written tradition back at least to Abraham, will change the ballgame for understanding the Bible.
Yeah, that would be that would be right. It would change everything because it would turn the Old Testament period. It seems to me, obviously, into a Christian period.
Yes,
that we do not have right now.
That's right.
And that is carried on from the Book of Mormon. One thing I say is, what your dad said, right, was well, when you pick up one end of the stick, you pick up the other.
Yeah.
And so when I think about the Book of Mormon as the stick of Joseph, I think we need to remember the other end of the stick that you're picking up is the brass plates.
Yeah.
Right? That is part of the stick, really, because that's where everything's drawn from.
Good point.
Is out of those brass plates. So, Noel, thank you so much. Really appreciate this. Maybe we can talk about this another time as you continue to
enjoy visiting with you.
Your research on this.
Okay. Good night.
Fun stuff. Appreciate it.
You bet.